Very great honour and pleasure to have a chance to talk briefly to Sir Peter Swinnerton-Dyer. Thank you very much indeed for coming to do such a thing. Can you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in Northumberland in 1927.
And tell me something about your family, as far back as you like. I mean, your grandparents, or how did you get a hyphenated name, for instance?
Because my family picked the wrong side in the Civil War and lost all their money, and the heir married the only daughter of a Lord Mayor of London who was called Swinnerton, and as long as the money lasts we shall be called Swinnerton-Dyer.
I see. And tell me something about your grandparents on either side.
My grandfather on my mother's side was a Newcastle businessman. My father's side was the son of an extremely successful businessman. My great-grandfather was managing director of Armstrong Whitworth. My grandfather, unfortunately, had no talent for gaining or even keeping money, and he invested a great deal in bogus Australian gold mines. However, my father, who was a successful businessman, left me sufficiently well off. So, for example, I was sent to Eton. In due course, though we are a younger branch of the family, the elder branch died out and I inherited the baronetcy, which goes with the knighthood which I earned as chairman of the UGC. And, well, that is roughly my family history.
Okay. Tell me what sort of man your father was.
A successful businessman and a country gentleman.
A nice man? Kind to you?
So-so.
So-so. Interested in academic things at all?
Not greatly, no. He was by training an engineer. I'm in fact in the male line the first of the family ever to have gone to university.
Gosh.
Though I'm not a typical first generation university entrant.
Not typical in the sense that you come from a wealthy middle class family. Yes. What about your mother? What sort of person was she and what did she do?
She was interested in everything, very lively, very vigorous. She ran anything she got her hands on, roughly speaking.
And was she kind and nice mother to you?
Yes.
And interested in academic, intellectual things? A reader?
Much more so than my father, yes.
What sort of childhood did you have? Were you allowed to roam around in the Northumberland countryside?
No, we moved to Shropshire when I was about 5. And so I think of myself as growing up in Shropshire and not in Northumberland. And we lived in the depths of the countryside, so yes, I did roam around.
Did you get interested in natural history and...
Not terribly, no.
You were more a reader?
I was a reader of books, and from a very early age it was clear that I would become a mathematician. From how early, do you think? My mother says that the only way of keeping me quiet in the bath was to give me sums.
And that was at what age? About?
That would have been at the age of 2.
Good heavens.
I think. Very simple sums, but even so.
Yes, yes. Tell me about your schools. What was the first school you went to?
The first school was what in earlier days would have called a dame's school in Church Stretton, which is one of the towns about 6-7 miles away. And then I went to the Dragon School.
Did you? I went there too.
Oh!
Yeah.
And then I went to Eton.
Well, when did you go to the Dragon?
1935.
Were there any teachers at the Dragon who you remember as influencing you at all?
Yes, one of them, the maths teacher.
What, do you remember his name?
Geoffrey Meister.
Meister, I remember that name, yes.
He lived out on Boar's Hill.
Mm. And were you already, by the Dragon, obviously very enthusiastic about mathematics? And,
Yes.
mm. And what about other things? Did you play games at the Dragon? It was a great game.
Yes, but not very successfully.
Mm.
I loathed cricket and continue to do so. So, my last year at the Dragon, I was allowed to play tennis instead of cricket.
Mm.
And then at Eton I rowed because that was the only alternative to cricket. And being large, I was a reasonably good oar.
Mm. The Dragon, when I was there, was very keen on music, particularly Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yes.
Had that started by then?
That had started, yes, and everyone was auditioned for the chorus.
Mm.
But since I have a voice like a corncrake, I didn't in fact get very far.
Mm. Have you ever been influenced or very enthusiastic about music?
Fairly enthusiastic, but the only thing I play is the gramophone.
Ah. And what kind of music do you like?
Opera more than anything else, and probably 18th century, so far as orchestral music is concerned.
And within 18th century, who was your...
Running from Bach to Beethoven, roughly, and Schubert, roughly speaking.
And Handel?
Yes, but he falls in that interval.
Yes. Right.
And anyway, the best Handel is certainly vocal.
Yes. Lovely. Moving on to Eton, did you enjoy your time there?
I think as much as I would have enjoyed any public school, and probably more than most.
Were there any teachers there who influenced you?
Not to the same extent, no.
But there were some good mathematicians, or?
There was some reasonably good mathematicians, yes, I think.
What else did you study? I mean, you can't just do mathematics.
Oh no, you had to do everything up to what is now GCSE, and was O-level.
Yeah.
My day, except that Eton being Eton, you didn't take public examinations at all. And so I had to do Latin, Greek, French, small amount of German, history, divinity, certain amount of science, physics and biology, but oddly enough not chemistry.
Did any of the other subjects particularly interest you? Are you a linguist, for instance?
No, I'm not at all a linguist. History, if anything, and I've continued to read history with enthusiasm, but some pleasure that I don't have to be a professional historian.
Why not?
Well, it looks to me awfully hard work grubbing in archives.
What Stalin described historians as archive rats.
Yes.
Not a very nice designation, but...
And Geoffrey Elton said that the best friends of historians were fire, water and rats.
You knew Geoffrey?
Yes.
He must have been...
he was about my age.
I met him a little towards the end of his life. What was he like as a... He was a formidable administrator or university politician.
He was a formidable university politician. Whether he was ever involved in administration, I don't know. I got on very well with him. I think largely because we disliked the same people. That's a bond of friendship.
Indeed. Well, he was reputedly, he was seen as quite a conservative figure, with a small c, in the university. Would that hint or suggest that this was how you were as well, or not?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher was also seen as a conservative figure.
Yes.
By those who weren't hit with the handbag.
So you were conservative?
Well, I used to describe myself as one of the few Thatcherites in the Labour Party, except that by now, of course, they're very commoner than any other sort of person in the Labour Party.
Indeed. In just finishing with Eton, what did you do? Public A levels at least.
We did, I think, the same exams, but they were privately marked.
I see. In what subjects did you do them? Mathematics?
Mathematics and physics, probably. I can't remember with any confidence.
And then you went, did you apply to several universities or just?
No, just to Trinity. I got a major scholarship, and that was well before you had to start applying anywhere else.
And did you apply to Trinity because of its famous reputation in mathematics?
Probably, yes. My father said it was the right place for me, and the school said it was the right place for me to go to, so as a dutiful youth I went.
And who were the, I mean, it was well beyond the age of Hardy and people like this. Who were the mathematicians?
Hardy was living my first year as an undergraduate, so I saw him sitting out in Great Court, but I never spoke to him. Littlewood was my research supervisor.
Was he?
The other outstanding mathematician of that generation was Besikovich.
Can you say anything about either of those two people as teachers or thinkers?
Well, Littlewood was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, in a distinctly old-fashioned way. And so I was brought up as an old-fashioned analyst and number theorist. Since I was primarily a number theorist, my natural research supervisor would have been Mordell, but he was a devoted and very bad bridge player, and if he'd been my supervisor, I would have had to play bridge with him about once a week, and the prospect did not attract me. Littlewood's technique with research students was very simple. He gave you a list of some 20 or 30 problems and said, go away and come back when you've done one of them. I only later learnt that the way the list was compiled was that they were all problems which a mathematician who he respected had seriously tried and failed to do. I did do one of them, so I got a research fellowship at the end of my second year. He had a list of rather easier problems which you got given in the third year, if necessary. I never saw that list. And then I had 4 years as a research fellow in Trinity, and then I got a Commonwealth Fund fellowship and went to Chicago, intending to work under Zygmunt, who I knew because he'd been in Cambridge one of my years as a research fellow. But within 24 hours I was kidnapped by André Weil, who was again one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, but as far removed in interest and style and everything from Littlewood as you can conceivably imagine. So mathematically I've been schizophrenic ever since.
What was if you can explain in very simple terms, what was the basic difference between the two sides?
Well, partly that Littlewood's interest was in old-fashioned methods, and Weil's interests were in very modern methods, and that related to the problems that they were interested in as well.
How did kidnapping sounds a strong word? How were you kidnapped exactly? Well, how did it occur? Did he come up to you and say, "I see you're very good. I want you to work with me," or what?
More or less, yes.
He must have heard you give a talk or something like this, was it?
No, but I think I had a certain reputation, and anyway, anybody with a Commonwealth Fund fellowship was, by definition, extremely good. You know, they were jolly difficult to get. They were at that time very attractive because they required you to spend 3 months of the summer travelling around the States. and though in theory that was to visit other universities where there was a colleague who shared interest with you, in practice for most Commonwealth Fund Fellows it meant going from one national park to another.
Just coming back to Cambridge, you were here in the late 30s, is that right? Or
No, I came up in 45.
45.
I'm not quite as old
No,
as
no.
that.
It was 35 you went to the Dragon, wasn't it?
Yes.
That's right. 45. So during the war...
I was at Eton.
At Eton, yes. Someone who's always interested me, but I think he may have been dead by 45, was Paul Dirac. Did you ever come across him at Trinity?
No, I didn't. He was still alive. He was at John's, of course.
Ah, right.
And I never acquired an interest in applied mathematics.
Did you ever think of staying in America? You had a research post there or fellowship there?
A research fellowship of a limited term.
Yeah.
And one had to come back, but no, I never seriously thought of staying in America.
Have you ever did you ever think later of going there?
Not permanently, no. When I came back to a teaching fellowship in Trinity, and if you're a bachelor, a teaching fellowship in Trinity is a very comfortable place.
Who else at Trinity became your friends? There were some mathematical economists and others. Were there any other people who you particularly got to know?
Well, Jack Gallagher above all.
The historian.
The Indian historian,
Yes. Yes.
Who was certainly my closest friend at high table. Eric Barnes, who was a mathematician, elected the same year as me. David Wheeler, who was a computer scientist, elected the following year.
Did you know Peter Laslett at all well?
Reasonably well, yes.
Who were the masters? Was Huxley master?
At one stage, yes. Trevelyan was master when I got a research fellowship.
What was he like? He was a very illustrious man.
He was a very illustrious man, but I scarcely had any conversation with him. He didn't have much interest in the scientists. Indeed, the fellowship admission dinner, where the master makes a long speech explaining about the qualities of the research fellows just elected, he devoted more time to George Carey, the one humanist, than to the 6 scientists put together.
You sound as if you vaguely resent that.
No, it's to be expected.
Whether there weren't any other, well, in Cambridge in general, outside Trinity, who were your closest friends and colleagues?
Maybe David Wheeler in the computer lab, because in fact I came back to a teaching fellowship in Trinity, but I couldn't get a university assistant lectureship. I lost out twice, once to Michael Attier, which was certainly the right decision, once to Christopher Zeeman, which was less clearly the right decision.
Michael is a mathematician as well, isn't he?
Michael is a mathematician.
And Zeeman...
Oh yes, these were assistant lectureships in pure mathematics.
Were you upset by this?
Well, there is pressure, certainly there was pressure in those days on anyone with a college fellowship to get a university job as well, so to relieve the financial pressure on the college. And in due course, in fact, being unable to get into pure mathematics, I got a position in the computer lab.
Did you? I didn't know that.
Yes, I spent something like 10 years there, and had I not been there, I don't think the Swinnerton-Dyer conjectures would ever have happened, because they couldn't have been made credible without the use of a computer, and in those very early days it was only privileged people who got the use of a computer.
You must have known Maurice Wilkins quite well.
Yes.
he was obviously very important in the development of computing
Yes.
in Cambridge. What was the generation of computers at that time? The IBM 370 or before that?
No, this is before that. Cambridge
The EDSAC?
had, the EDSAC 1 was on some criteria the first working computer ever built. It's a very delicate criterion. It was the first British computer to run a program correctly. Not the first to run a program. The Manchester one beat it by a few days, but there was a bug in the program.
What a fine distinction, yes.
Yes.
What about the one in America, the Chicago or somewhere there was...
No, Pennsylvania, I
Yes.
think. ENIAC.
ENIAC, yes.
I'm not sure what the timing was of that.
You mentioned your famous conjecture with Birch. Birch
Yes.
was at Oxford, wasn't he?
Birch was at that time at Cambridge. He was a research fellow in Trinity, a few years later than me, partly because he'd done national service and I hadn't.
What was his first name?
Brian.
Brian. And how did you come to work together? I mean, just because you were in Trinity, or...?
Just because we were in Trinity and pure maths research fellows, indeed number theorists, and we got on together.
This is probably an impossible question, but as I mentioned, John Coates referred to his great life's work being to look at your famous conjecture. For someone like myself who knows very little about mathematics, is it possible just to outline what it's about? What is the question to which this is a conjectural answer?
The question, suppose you have a curve, a cubic curve in the plane, and you know a rational point on it, then it turns out that the set of all points on it form an abelian group in a natural way. And the question is the structure of that group. And it had been well known for a long time that the torsion part of it was finite, and by now everything is known about the torsion part. And it was proved by Mordell that there are only finitely many generators of infinite order. The great problem is how many generators of infinite order, and that was at that time regarded as one of those questions to which there could not be a sensible answer, partly because it appeared to most of the people who worked in that area that there was nothing in terms of which to express it. Well, we found conjecturally that there was a sensible answer and stated it in some detail. But now there is a very big gap between conjecture and proof.
And has it ever been proved?
No.
No.
Special cases are now proved, but really only very special cases. And it is one of the 7 Clay Institute $1 million problems. So if you solve it, you get $1 million. But robbing a bank is really easier.
Do you think it is solvable?
Yes, but I don't expect it to happen in my lifetime. Indeed, I rather hope it doesn't happen in my lifetime, because I shall have to try and understand the proof, and I'm too old for that.
They will certainly ask you to adjudicate. Is Birch still alive?
Yes.
You mentioned that computing was very important in the early formulation of this, but will computers and the increasing power of computers help in solving it?
No, I think not at all.
Is there anyone who's come closer than others to the solution, as far as you know, like John Coates or anyone else?
John Coates is one of the people who has proved special cases. But the special cases all depend on a very special property which certainly does not generalize.
How is it that someone who is obviously so entirely intellectual and involved in mathematics ended up as chairman of the UGC?
It's a long and complicated story. I was never exclusively involved in mathematics. I captained the university chess team as an undergraduate, and I got dragged into being president of the University Bridge Club by somebody who wanted to run it, but it being only about to become second year, I had to run it as secretary and had to have a front man as a president. And I discovered gradually that I played bridge rather well, and I would probably have been rated as one of the 10 top players in the country. I certainly played in the European Championships twice, representing Britain. I gave it up eventually, but partly because it was taking too much time travelling to London all the time, and partly because out of pure curiosity I became interested in university affairs. And the only body it was at all easy to get onto was the Council of the Senate. It's good advice for a career, always to enter everything at the top, of course. And one way and another, the force was with me as it appeared, and I got deeper and deeper involved in university affairs.
But what date was this?
This must have been the 60s. Certainly by the troubles of 68, I was regarded as the only member of the Council of the Senate who really talked to undergraduates.
Really? Took to them in the sense of being sympathetic to them?
Yes, I said talked.
Oh, talked to. Yeah, I'm very deaf, sorry. Talked to the undergraduates.
Yes. But probably the only one who was really sympathetic to them. And St. Catherine's, who hadn't had a vice-chancellor for 150 years, when they had a vacancy, decided that I was a good bet to be vice-chancellor.
You were by now a fellow of St. Catherine's?
No, I was a fellow of Trinity.
Yeah, I see.
And I'd had no contact with St. Catherine's at all, but they elected me master. The other thing that worked in my favour was that I was a bachelor, and you know the classic quarrel in a college is apt to be between the bursar and the master's wife. Well, St. Catherine's had had that in spades.
Yes.
Yes, you will know about that because that happens in King's, I think.
It has been known to happen.
Yes. And so a bachelor, well, at least rendered that impossible. And I duly was elected vice-chancellor.
Tell me, just quickly, what was it like being master of St. Catherine's College? Did you enjoy that?
Yes, I did, on the whole. It had its difficult moments.
What qualities do you think helped most? I've talked to masters of a number of colleges, but they mainly stress, getting to know a lot of people and recognising people as you go past them and so on, a feeling of involvement.
That's true. It seemed to me that getting to know the undergraduates was crucial, though not every head of house has taken that view over the years. And St. Catherine's being famously a games-playing college, that meant a good deal of touchline duty. But you can think about mathematics while standing on the touchline and cheering your team on, so that wasn't too bad. Patience, letting the senior tutor and the senior bursar run the college. That's the other great fault of some masters, that they think they can override their principal officers.
Did you have good officers when you were at St Catherine's?
Yes, I think so.
How did you balance being vice-chancellor and the master of the college?
Oh, the vice-chancellorship in those days was a position of dignity rather than power. It was a 2-year job, because it lasted any longer than 2 years and you'd have had your trousers let out. But it was not the vice-chancellor's job to get his own way or formulate his own policies. If you wanted to get things done, you did that before you were vice-chancellor. Even Arthur Armitage, who must have been the most formidable figure as vice-chancellor in the whole of my time in Cambridge, got his way before and not as vice-chancellor. He then went off to Manchester to be a proper vice-chancellor.
So you had very little power, but quite a lot of responsibility and
Yes.
Ceremonial duties.
Yes.
What did you chair? Did you chair the General Board, or?
You chaired in those days the Council of the Senate, the General Board.
Not the Financial Board, I don't suppose.
Yes, the Financial Board as well, but apart from that, sundry minor committees.
And this was this right in the middle of 68, 60?
I was on the Council of the Senate already in 68, and involved when they besieged the old schools while the council was sitting. I was the member of the council sent out to tell them that they were not going to get what they wanted.
With what? How did they greet you?
Not as unfavourably as you might think. Better than Paris undergraduates would have greeted the corresponding figure.
Were there also those sorts of tensions within St Catherine's, or?
No, St Catherine's was a very old-fashioned college. At one time, under my predecessor as master, so in 68, some King's undergraduates came in and into hall while he was dining and blew a trumpet under his nose.
Which he tried studiously to...
I was still in Trinity then, so I only heard about this at second hand.
Were you...
Kings, of course, took the view, let boys be boys.
Yes, of course. Where were you when the Garden House affair blew up?
I was still in Trinity.
Were you? But were you on the Council of the Senate?
Yes.
What were your views about the very stern punishment which was meted out to those involved?
Well, it wasn't. The person responsible for it was acquitted.
But some of the other people were, I seem to remember, were they imprisoned, or?
I don't think in the end, no. No, I was not sympathetic with them.
Moving on to the University Grants UGC, how long were you there and when?
I was there for 5.5 years of the UGC and then 3 years of the University's Funding Council.
As head of both?
Head of the UGC, Chief Executive of the Funding Council.
So 8 years of a very formative time. This is nearly all under Margaret Thatcher, or?
All, I think, under Margaret Thatcher, yes.
And you were placed in this, to external observers, difficult position of mediating between Margaret Thatcher, who had strong views about universities, and the university. Is that a correct representation of it?
Not entirely the way I saw it. I had considerable sympathy with Margaret Thatcher's views on universities, which were widely held in the top ranks of the civil service as well, who remembered the university from the days when they'd been undergraduates and thought there was an awful lot of rubbish that needed clearing out. And indeed there was. If you want a confirmation of that, read my farewell speech as vice-chancellor.
I will. But can you just tell us what's the nature of the rubbish?
People essentially neglecting their duties and not merely not being thrown out, but being rather loved and admired.
Well, there's structural rubbish as well, as well as personal.
There was, an extreme reluctance to take decisions, even to answer questions in a hurry. You know the story of the great reforming government of 1832 and their communication with Oxford, do you?
No.
Well, among other things, they wrote to Oxford saying that perhaps it was about time they looked at their statutes and updated them, to which the University of Oxford replied that they had had a careful and thorough examination of their statutes in the 1630s, and they thought it would be premature to do it again. And that, I think, was a widespread attitude. And so a lot of my job was to convince universities that they were in the late 20th century under a Prime Minister whose deepest urge was spring cleaning. Women are devoted to spring cleaning, and Mrs. Thatcher more than most. And the need to persuade vice-chancellors that it was their job to lead the university and not just to make good after-dinner speeches. And the need to shift power from senates to councils. None of that, of course, applies to Oxford and Cambridge, which have a different and peculiar structure. But there too, the need to recognise reality and not just say, all this nonsense, they'll get over it in due course, and will recognise that Oxford and Cambridge are wonderful and must be preserved untouched. And indeed, all universities have greatly changed.
You must have had a certain amount of personal dealing with Margaret Thatcher. What sort of person was she?
Really rather little dealing. I liked her. I suppose in her latter days she got madder and madder, but I never saw her really in her latter days. But the principal dealings I had was with Keith Joseph, who was Secretary of State for Education for most of my time at the UGC, and who was a lovely man. Very courteous, very reasonable, prepared to think through any problem very thoroughly, and very reluctant actually to do anything as a result of thinking through it.
And someone who esteemed academics too.
Someone who esteemed academics, certainly.
Because he was associated with All Souls in some way, wasn't he?
He'd been a Fellow of All Souls, yes.
I wondered if you'd come across my uncle at all. He was the Conservative Member of Parliament for Cambridge, Robert Rhodes James.
Yes, I knew him quite well.
How did you... Is there anything you can say about him as a colleague or person?
Very nice, very reasonable, sympathetic to universities, very much on the left wing of the party, scarcely at all a Thatcherite. Indeed, when the Social Democrats split from the Labour Party, I tried to persuade him to join the Social Democrats, with which he clearly had considerable sympathies. but not sufficiently to do that.
Mm. That's interesting. I didn't know that about him. Let's just move on. While you were doing all this administrative and other work, you mentioned that you can do mathematics while watching people playing rugby. Could you do mathematics while administering the UGC?
Not much. I still did a certain amount. And once I retired from the UFC, I've been able to go back to mathematics. And I'm still doing good research. I was involved in two major inquiries. I chaired the London University inquiry, which they said that the smaller colleges were not going to be viable under the increased financial pressures and had to be merged into bigger ones, which happened. And the committee which was set up to merge the Ulster Polytechnic and the new University of Ulster, the only shotgun marriage I've ever heard of which needed two shotguns.
In both cases it was a successful report and led to the outcome.
In both cases it was successful, yes.
I mean, as you obviously are a very experienced administrator, what qualities do you think are required for that role that you've undertaken?
Well, I would distinguish between an administrator and a policymaker. I've never been an administrator, and I think I would be rather bad at it, actually. I've been a policymaker, and perhaps the two most important things are to judge what are the limits of the practical and to put yourself in the other people's minds. There's a saying in S.J. Simon's Why You Lose at Bridge, book which in some ways has influenced me more than any other, probably, which says, you should always seek for the best result possible, not the best possible result.
The art of the possible, the famous...
Sorry? The art of the possible, yes. And of course there's the Duke of Wellington's famous answer when he was asked what was the secret of his military success. I always tried to know what was going on the other side of the hill.
And how did you do this? By talking to people? By empathetic?
Saying what I would think if I were in their shoes and held their opinions. It's probably the same talent that was developed by my years as a bridge player, for which putting yourself in the other man's shoes is also crucial.
You mentioned a number of times that you were a bachelor fellow, but now you're not, you're married, is that right?
I'm married, yes. I married at the very end of my mastership of St. Catherine's.
And does your wife have a career or...?
She is an archaeologist, so I've got to take an interest in her subject because it's cultural, but she doesn't have to take an interest in mine.
What kind of archaeology?
She's also my second cousin.
What kind of archaeology does she do?
Middle Eastern. She used to dig in Mesopotamia before we were married. After that she moved first to Bahrain and then to Kuwait. And she is now settled for being a senior figure and going round commenting on what's in museums.
What is her name? What was her married name?
Harriet Crawford.
Oh yes, I know. I knew Harriet Crawford, yes. I know her. A stereotype of mathematicians is that they do a lot of their best work when they're quite young. And you mentioned that if the Swinnerton-Dyer conjecture was supposedly proven, you would find it difficult to find out whether this was the case. Have you felt, is there a curve in your own life of mathematical energy and ability, do you feel?
Yes, I have less energy. than I used to, not necessarily less ability, and the statement that mathematicians do their best work when they're young is really based on two famous cases of two of the greatest 18th century mathematicians who died in their 30s. And so
one doesn't know. Who were they?
one was Abel, the Norwegian, the other was Galois. Abel died of consumption, I think. Galois died in a duel.
It would be the same sort of inference from the early death of Keats or something like this.
Yes. But for example, Littlewood was still doing good research in his 80s. He finally had to give it up, not because he'd run out of ability, but because he could no longer read his own handwriting.
Returning to the university, is there anything you could say about Cambridge as a university that is special from your experience of all these other universities? Perhaps Oxford would fall into the same bracket, but...
Yes, Oxford claim that I don't understand Oxford, that I believe it's just the same as Cambridge, which is not true, but I don't understand Oxford.
Do you understand Cambridge?
Probably I did understand Cambridge as well as anyone, but of course Cambridge has changed quite a bit, and I've not really kept up with the changes.
I'm writing a book on the history of Cambridge and increasingly confused, so can you give me any idea or guidance on what would be the keys to understanding it when you were in the position of understanding it more?
Did you, when you were young, play a game called Grandmother's Footsteps?
Yes, I did.
Well, you'll remember the situation. Grandmother turns round and everything is absolutely still.
Exactly.
After a bit she turns round again and everything is absolutely still, but they've moved forward.
Exactly.
Cambridge is like that. You can never observe it changing. You can observe that it has changed. Oxford is different.
What would be the analogy for Oxford?
I don't have an analogy for Oxford.
But you can watch it changing.
You can watch it changing or refusing to change. Under the present vice-chancellor, you can watch it refusing to change. But then his technique of reform is not skilled.
As you know, many people ask the question, where is the university? And if they ask taxi drivers such a question at the station, the taxi driver looks bemused and says, I don't know where the university is. Would you like me to take you to the King's College or something? I mean, where is the university?
Well, by now there are sufficiently many buildings the other side of the river that the university is essentially there, I think.
Physically there, but in terms of distributed power...
In terms of distributed power, the great scientific departments probably, and they represent a permanent pressure for progress. And whereas the classical humanities represent a permanent pressure for stasis. And part of the difference between Oxford and Cambridge is that the balance between the two is very different. Cambridge, the sciences dominate, because they always have.
Since the 18th century.
The classics, the humanities dominate.
That would lead one to infer that Oxford is more conservative and slower in its changing.
Yes. And also, for various reasons, the balance of power between colleges and the university, by which essentially I mean the departments, colleges are much more important in Oxford.
How well do you think the balance between colleges and departments works here? There is a tension all the time. Do you think it's...
There's a tension, but I think it works tolerably well.
As a place for encouraging creative thought, do you think this organisational structure is pretty good, or...?
It works. Why it works, God knows. That's a sociologist's problem, not a mathematician's. But empirically, it does seem to work pretty well.
Have you found other universities elsewhere that it works even better?
Harvard. But I doubt if there's any university in Britain that I know well enough, apart from Cambridge, to say that.
I often ask people if they were giving advice to a young student starting out in their subject, what would they advise them, starting out on a research career in their subject? Is there anything that you would say to such a person in pure mathematics?
Not really. Choose to go to somewhere who has somebody really good in the topics that interest you. That's far more important than the overall reputation of the university.
Is it still a sort of mentoring kind of subject, mathematics? In other words, you are very influenced by one or two people who supervise you?
Usually, not always.
And just coming back, I heard that you have a lovely garden, and is that your work or your wife's work, or?
The cultivated part of the garden is her work. It's got a big wood, about 4 acres of wood at the back of it, which once was elm and has therefore become dead elm, nettles and elder, and I'm gradually trying to reduce that to order. But you know Triplo has a daffodil weekend at which a lot of gardens are open, including ours. And a lady a few years back came up to my wife and said, "I see you like a wild garden."
Was she a bit upset, or?
She was furious.
Well, we've touched on a lot of things in a very quick way. Was there anything particular that I should have asked you that you would like to have put on record?
I don't think so, no. I'm not terribly interested in putting things on record.
There's no part of your life which has been very important to you which I've largely missed?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I think we'll stop there, and thank you very much indeed for the interview.